Angels in Genesis 6. A difficult passage. And any good commentary or book on angels will have a listing of the different views, and you will be able to follow their arguments as they do pros and cons and such like. If you look at the chart number 42 of Wayne House, I don't think you have it, but if you take a look at it, you'll notice there are three distinct views that are put forward by the various commentators. The angelic creatures view, which is one that's well known. Angelic creatures or supernatural beings, usually seen to be demonic rather than anything else. Or apostate Sethites, that is, those of the godly line of Seth have gone apostate and have married Canaanite woman of the line of Cain. Non-supernatural, obviously, but ungodly Sethites, resulting in only one man finding favor in the eyes of God, Noah. Or ambitious despots, mighty rulers, kings, tyrants, would all fall under that category. And if you were to check chart number 42 of Wayne House, he deals with it under persons, perversion, progeny. In the angelic creatures, it's often concluded that the progeny is these monstrous giants, Nephilim, are seen as being the product of the marriage, or wicked tyrants or dynastic rulers would be the other two views. A number of proofs are given for each. Problems are also presented for each view, and then a list of proponents. And it's interesting to observe that for angelic creatures, most of these older Old Testament writers agree. Albright, Gabeline, Kelly, Unger, Wardkey, Delish, Larkin, Pember, Wiest, Gray, Torrey, Mayer, Plummer, etc. It's quite a list. Then you move over to apostate Sethites and it drops down in number. But you have Hengstenberg and Kyle. So Kyle and Delish obviously didn't quite agree. Jameson, Fawcett and Brown, Schofield, Lincoln, Murray, Baxter, Scroggie and Leupold. And ambitious despots, the number drops even further. Kaiser, Klein, Kornfeld, a guy called Kober. And you probably could find a number of others. But angelic creatures has kind of stuck over the years. It's what I've called a notoriously enigmatic passage with no resolution.
Are you on 3 right now? Where it says
I'm on
further observations?
C1. Angels and Genesis about 78, I think for you, 76, 77, 78. You found it?
Yes.
Put up front, no resolution. If you did reading on this in Page, he's pretty forthright. It says here, and I'll do this in advance just to remind you of text. The account of the intermarriage of the sons of God with the daughters of men is one of the most obscure and controversial passages in the Old Testament. The brevity, the unusual nature, and different expressions make it an exegetical battleground. He tries to deal with it, he does quite a thorough job, but he ends up agreeing, I don't know what's going on. Albertus Peters, in his fairly well-known commentary Notes on Genesis, 1947, I think makes quite a statement. What does Moses mean? Good question. I do not know, and I do not believe anyone knows. So far as I'm concerned, the passage is unintelligible. Meaning, when you're preaching your way through Genesis, skip to Genesis 6, verse 9. Because otherwise you may be sharing doubts with your congregation. It certainly is controversial for 2,000 years. Quite a dispute. Interestingly enough, on the one hand, liberal theologians, and I put this in as a quote for you from Robert Newman, this article by Robert Newman, The Ancient Exegesis of Genesis 6, 2 and 4, is very interesting. Liberal theologians who deny the miraculous claim the account pictures a supernatural liaison between divine beings and humans. Now, they don't really have place for the supernatural or really for the angelic realm, and they would deny any form of the miraculous. They nevertheless see something preternatural, supernaturally involved. Conservative theologians, however, on the other hand, who believe in angels and demons, the angelic realm, and the biblical record of what takes place in that realm beyond us, tend to deny the passage any such meaning of angels with men. Find that extremely intriguing. Of course, liberals would explain it away as a legend or some other saga or myth. And we have to acknowledge with Casuto, this is an obscure section. All the different views just point to something of the confusion. Its significance is clouded, and sometimes the views read so much in, by the time you get to the end of what the guy's describing, it becomes almost incomprehensible from the text he derived it from. Sidney Page said this: "It is tantalizingly brief and mysterious, provoking many questions for which it provides no answers." I don't want to be sort of left standing with no idea at all of where to lean. I must have some conclusion that I can draw. A couple of things, therefore, can be stated. First off, we are reading the pre-flood description of man's degeneration. That's as clear as anything in the text. Man has degenerated to quite a depth, so much so that it necessitates God bringing the flood, global flood, to destroy mankind. When you start to read, you may not be fully aware of that in chapter 6, but as you move on, your first indication that the text is going to deal with something serious is, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. Something of a holding back of God's spirit is being necessitated. There were giants in the earth in those days, also afterwards. And the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown." And then the text breaks in. "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth." And the description in the next few verses indicates to you that man is thoroughly depraved, reached a point of a depth of depravity that could not be allowed to continue. "I will destroy man whom I have created." And then stops and begins with the genealogy of Noah, moves into the time of the flood. So, okay, we're aware now, by the time you get through verse 8, we are reading pre-flood degeneration. Chapter 4, chapter 5 show the genealogies of Cain and Lamech and Seth. But as the fallen race multiplied and expanded, so did evil. That's obvious. two genealogies have traced a rapid development of mankind, skipping quite a long period of time apparently. But man has expanded across the globe. There's been a population explosion. Demographics have changed abruptly from the two. And now there's quite a large number of men and women. I mean, that's pretty obvious just by reading the text. But wickedness has increased incredibly. So John Davis, in his Paradise to Prison, the quote I've given you, says the nature and extent of God's judicial acts always reflects the seriousness of sin which is being judged. With the exception of Noah's family, the flood destroyed all human life. So God clearly considered the sins of the antediluvian race to be so wicked that nothing short of total destruction would satisfy his holy demands. It's a profound statement. Evil so great. I'm not sure that we can fully identify with what it was like back then in terms of depravity and anarchy. It was so complete, violence and wickedness at such a high degree that it necessitated drastic judicial action. Yeah, Steve.
Referring to the pre-flood degeneration, you were saying that 120 years, God placed that time frame on people prior to the flood or after the flood? I maybe just didn't understand what you said.
I didn't make a comment like that actually. I didn't make that comment, but there was obviously a 120-year waiting period while the ark was being built. But men didn't get any better at all. Violence has reached a peak in the history of the world. That would be within the first 1600 odd years. That's the incredible impact of the fall of man. Summary state of affairs for Adam's descendants in the opening verses of chapter 6, opening 8 verses, tells you what's happening to the world. Corruption of man. So in verses 1 through 4 you have the episode of the sons of God, which asks a lot of questions about who are they, what's going on here. Verses 5 through 8 establishes the corruption of mankind. 9 through 12 details the generations of Noah, who is the one man who walked with God, found favor. And then verses 13 through 21, God's command to build the ark. Carefully, systematically, obviously well designed for what was to come. But we keep coming back to verses 5 through 8 and the reason for the flood. So I made some observations for you here. I've just listed them, A through M. Let's just deal with these one by one. Series of observations on the Genesis account. First thing we will assert very clearly, and I've probably done that already, is that this is not mythological, not even atheologically mythical. This is not looking for the meaning of something in particular. This is not legend. This is historical narrative recording facts. There's no reason to make this some other form of genre than historical narrative. It details exactly what is taking place. Davis points out, and a number of others have done so as well, that angels are not in the immediate or the remote context. So to classify sons of God as angels would be to import from somewhere else that particular meaning. You'd have to go to later texts and later revelation to inform the earlier revelation. 3:24, however, they were the cherubim, weren't they? So to say there's nothing in the immediate context is one thing. In a broader context, certainly the cherubim, God in the way into the Garden of Eden, Genesis 3:24. And chapter 18 also deals with the three men that came to visit Abraham. So it's not that remote. But how far do you go to import from somewhere else a meaning for sons of God? Good question. Man is indeed the focus of attention. Repeatedly, in the immediate context and succeeding contexts, it is man who's being judged. It is man who is depraved. It is man that is destroyed. So who are the sons of God? If sons of God were angelic beings, and don't draw any conclusions about where I'm going just yet. If sons of God are angelic beings, and who were the ones that initiated what was such a heinous sin that it necessitated God taking action, then one wonders why men are the focus of judgment, and no judgment pronounced on the sons of God as a separate set of separate beings or race of creatures. Very much so, mankind is judged. It's his thoughts, his actions, his violence, his wickedness that receives attention. That's enough, I think, to at least propose that sons of God would be a form, no, let me reword that, would be part of mankind, that he receives a classification different from ordinary men. Now you've got two options here. If you think about that, if you drop back to verse 2, the sons of God saw the daughters of men. If you propose an angelic view, you would look at verses 1 and 2 and then say, see, men began to multiply, daughters of men were born. So sons of God must be a different quality from men. There were men multiplying, there were daughters of men. Sons of God must be separate. It's a designation of something other than mankind. It's a contrast. Or you could say that sons of God becomes the designation of a group of men within mankind in general. You understand? Would be just as easy. So it's not saying sons of God that is removed from mankind, other forms of creatures now determine what they were. It is mankind belonging to a particular line. In that case, it would most probably be associated with Seth. Okay. If angels, point C, they sin by taking woman. But if men, they sin by taking wives of all which they choose, all they chose, and are guilty of polygamy, or maybe, if this is a frequentative Oxyenzart, of the development of harems. They just repeatedly kept taking these wives, again and again and again, without any regard to whatever parameters God had set up with Adam and Eve. Man and a woman shall leave their homes, and leave and cleave. And it's obviously one man and one woman. Here would be polygamy being seen, and usually associated, because of the later texts, wickedness of man is great in the earth, every intent evil continually. It's usually imported back to the earlier texts to say that obviously this development of harems or polygamy was a taking again and again in violence. That some sort of violent action is to be associated with that. Violent coercion of marriage, grabbing of a woman from her home. The problem is that the explanations start to expand way beyond the text. And you begin to say, where do you get all this from? It almost becomes if I can use an illustration from archaeology, a reconstruction process. That is, you find the knee bone of a monkey and you construct in the background an entire village of Neanderthal men. Okay? If you're not careful, you have some limited information here, and you mustn't go on constructing a whole picture of a whole lot of things you really don't know about. Was it violence? Obviously there was corruption involved, but stay with the text. If it's daughters of men being given a special designation as the offspring of the Cainite line, I mean, say, can this be associated with unbelievers? Daughters of men would be an unknown and unconfirmed designation for unbelievers. What I'm reacting to here is the idea that here's godliness and here's ungodliness. All these descendants are ungodly, all these descendants are godly. You have to stop and say, hold on a second. Can I speak about a godly line as though every member of the descent of that line is classified as a godly person? That would be most unusual. To have two descents, always ungodly, always godly, unless you have specific information detailing that. So daughters of men would just simply be daughters of men. Might be something of a, what's the word I want? When you use more words than you should, it may be a superfluous term, somewhat verbose, but when daughters of men were born, sons of God saw them. A particular group of men saw them. And they were beautiful. Maybe that has some bearing on the situation. However, is this correct? The daughters of men were beautiful to the sons of God through the eyes of lust, which led to their marriage without discrimination, rushing onward according to their lust. What's the problem? It's not a rejection statement, but what's the problem with a comment like that? Seen as beautiful through the eyes of lust. Yeah, it doesn't say it at all. It's something that has to be brought in from somewhere. The element of lust would seem to be introducing an idea foreign to the text, maybe prejudges the case. All that can be said is that there was an attractive appearance of human daughters that made them appealing to the sons of God. Whoever the sons of God were, they were attracted to the beauty of these women. The Nephilim, who are they? Offspring of those marriages? Are these the mighty men, the men of renown? Are they the monstrosities, the giants that are the result of sons of God and daughters of men? It's interesting, when you do your Hebrew exegesis in Genesis 6 sometime in the future, you'll notice that verse 4 with Nephilim begins with the noun and the definite article. There's no vav, conjunction or consecutive at all. It breaks the flow. You have the normal sequence of vavs, or wows as you call them, from verses 1, I think the German pronunciation is better, verses 1, 2, 3, 4. You have the normal sequence taking place, then, or and, then. And then, that's mine. It breaks. The Nephilim were on the earth at that time. It's apparently a statement that's been made that may not make it that easy to tie them in as the progeny of the marriage. Just the observation of fact, there were giants in those days, as there would afterwards. And so they were there already when sons of God and daughters of men married. It doesn't appear to be stating they began. Okay? They predated, as it were. And there were Nephilim or Anakim later in Numbers 13. Whatever the Nephilim were, they died in the flood. And there apparently was enough of a DNA or genetic, enough in the genetic pool, however you want to describe it, that they did come out through the line descended from Noah. I think it's intriguing because the Nephilim apparently were ordinary people, ordinary men, not a weird monstrosity. Now think about this. I'm not sure how to handle this. Here's Adamite factor. These are the descendants of Adam. This is what God created. And here's angelic being. So here's daughters of men that are descendants of Adam. Here's angelic beings. What's the product? It would be weird. Half man, half angel. 3/4 angel, quarter man. It sort of sets you, it makes you grit your teeth, doesn't it? What are we talking about here? There would be a violation of kind producing kind. Doesn't make sense to talk about angels mating with women and having a progeny that can be identified as being after the flood. At the very least, you can say this: whatever that marrying was, it was all destroyed at the flood and is not there afterwards. But that's one of the reasons, by the way, that my own mind, I tend to lean towards the angelic, but it's like this. I'm leaning over, my foot is up, and it's dangling over that option, but I haven't put it down yet. I'm leaning there, and I'm hovering, not quite ready to go. Made my decision. Right over here, it's angelic creatures with human woman. Two distinct groups. Sons of God, contextually appropriate designation for men. If you look at Expositor's Bible commentary, comment is made that men are called the sons of God in order to show their origin from God. That is, Adam was a son of God, so all descendants of Adam would be called sons of God. Stressing this. And women are called the daughters of man to denote what? Now just put this together in your mind and think. If Adam was made by God and is legitimately called a son of God because of his origin at the hand of God, therefore all male descendants of Adam can be called sons of God. Women are called daughters of men because came out of Adam. So it's Eve and Adam, no, female and male, that are being referred to here in this particular text. The Lord God made man and woman. It's just simply relationships between men and women. Could be polygamy still, could be harem gathering, could be violence and corruption, but it simply sees sons of God as being men who descended from Adam, keeping it within the human race. Yes, Sam.
How do we reason out Job 38 verse 7, where you refer to the sons of God, and Hebrews 1:8?
So the sons of God in the Old Testament, and a good commentary will show you the references, can also be used for men, not just for angels. Can be used for angels. Elohim could also be used in the sense of mighty ones. So it can refer to angels, can refer to men. Which one is the option for Genesis 6? That's the problem. It's not can you deal with Genesis, can you deal with Job? It's does angelic being fit the context in Genesis 6? That's the issue that always comes up. What are you going to do? Are you going to go with men, a designation of men within the group of men as a whole, or are you going to import the title from somewhere else to mean angelic creatures, because it's there in Job? And either one is acceptable. Then you start asking, but what about? But what about? Point H. Yeah, John.
I'm just curious, this may be thinking it through, the question of if this could happen pre-flood,
Yeah.
what keeps it from happening today? I know we're in speculation mode, but it would seem like, did all the demons who had this ability die and get wiped? I don't know.
That's right, I don't know. You just say the flood wiped that out. So that you may have demon-possessed men being violent towards women. This would be the only, I would say, if it is angelic beings, sons of God, then whatever was the progeny or the case, even if there was a progeny, it's all wiped out at the flood. And the flood settles that. It's gone. It's removed from human history. There are ancient stories and legends of titans, of demigods, which I think are probably distorted explanations of what took place. The legends that develop are exactly that. It is not a parallel version of the scriptural text. You understand? You don't want to go in that direction. These legends that are much later in history are distorted explanations for something in the past. This very well could be the case with demigods and titans. It may just suggest that somewhere in the explanation historically, angels were involved. But don't make it an equal parallel. Sumerian and other ancient Near Eastern flood stories do talk about kings centering in cities, do talk about giant rulers, men of renown, militarily skillful individuals who built big cities, set up empires, controlled vast portions of territory. And it is true that the kings were seen as being the sons of God. So sons of God, for some therefore, means kings or rulers. But that's much later that you find that occurring. So once again, you don't want to simply say, we got a borrowing taking place or an equal teaching taking place. Kings later in history were called sons of God or had some association with gods. Don't have to read that back into the pre-flood account. Nephilim is sometimes taken as coming from Nephal, fallen ones, that is, demons who possessed women, but didn't possess, demons who possessed men, but not demons who possessed women. Interesting. There are a number of other options as well. I think there's 5 or 6 lexical options for Nephilim. One would mean to fall upon in the sense of being violent, or even the sense of being strong. So lexically, you're not going to solve the answer. Preceding context establishes some thematic link. There is city building taking place. There is apparently polygamy. There could obviously have been tyranny as well, or at least, there was some sort of violence or reaction, because your mind should drop back to Genesis 4. And the close of Genesis 4, remember? Then Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. Wives of Lamech, not wife of, but wives of, listen to my speech. For I have killed a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. Arrogance, polygamy, violence. You hurt me, I kill you. That's the picture at the end of chapter 4. And it's intriguing, because as you read the next two verses, notice the change. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. For God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. Seeing something of the promise of God here. And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of God. There's a verb consecutive here. Major change. Stops with Lamech's statement of arrogance, and then wraps up the genealogy in chapter 4 with then men began to call upon the name of the Lord, and then steps back in chapter 5 to the genealogy of Adam through Seth, all the way down to Noah, who finds favor in the eyes of God. So a thematic link may be there. That's important. Why? Because if there is such a thematic link of city building, polygamy, tyranny, etc., and this men began to call on the name of the Lord, you have the reasons to establish two particular lines. One line that has a godly heritage, not that every member of that line would be godly, but has a godly heritage through Seth and Enosh. And another line that ends with arrogance and murder and obvious polygamy. Line of Cain through Lamech. But I keep coming back to this sons of God question, point L. Can demon-possessed men be referred to as sons of God? That's an important question for me to settle. Can I define these as being demon-possessed men or demons? Can demons be called sons of God? If that's what we're talking about. Is there any significance in viewing verses 1 through 4 as a summary of a state of affairs? Not part of the preface to the flood? No. John Salinger suggests that, but I think we have to say verses 1 through 4, 5 through 8 stand together, obviously referring to what was happening immediately before the flood. Okay. Any questions on that so far, Jeff?
I don't know if you're going to discuss it in a minute, but I don't know, one of the arguments that a lot of people who lean towards seeing these passage as being angelic beings go to the New Testament, like 1 Peter 3 and
Jude 6.
Yeah. Are we able to impose the New Testament in such a way? Because, I mean, if you're reading as an Old Testament believer this story, obviously you don't have that scripture to refer to, trying to draw in.
Well, you can go to Jude 6, but even Jude 6 has brought about a variety of opinions. So when you look at Jude 6, either you go to the structure of Jude as a whole, where you'll have the emphasis on the fact that those who disobeyed will be judged. So you've got several examples there of that. Or you take it as being a reference to the fact that somewhere angels went off to strange flesh. It becomes a question of how do you identify the antecedent of these. If you look at Jude 6, it says, Jude 7, Well, let me go back to 6, pick up the flow. And the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abodes, so they broke from the parameters God set. He has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. As Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them in similar manner to these, who? To angels? Or to verse 4, certain men have crept in unnoticed who were long ago marked out for this condemnation, ungodly men. Which is the antecedent of the these? Is it the nearest one? Sodom and Gomorrah? Or the angels? Or is it the men of verse 4? You've got to answer that question when you deal with Jude. It could be masculine, it could be neuter. Sodom and Gomorrah, angels, and then the angels are seen as being given over to sexual immorality, going after strange flesh that would not be like their own. Or it's a reference to the ungodliness of the men that crept in unawares. It doesn't have to have that direct connection with Genesis 6. Suffering vengeance, not escaping judgment, would be the emphasis in Jude. Or it is a reference. What about verse 8? Likewise also these dreamers. Who? Who's the these dreamers? Sodom and Gomorrah? No. Angels? No. Men that have crept in unawares? Yes. So which one is it going to be? Defile the flesh, reject authority, speak evil of dignitaries, and from that point on you understand that the whole reference is back to certain men have crept in unnoticed who long ago were marked out ungodly men, turned the grace of our God into lasciviousness, which would be immorality as well. That's the focus of attention in the book of Jude. The fact that angels couldn't escape judgment when they rebelled against God stands as a warning to these men that they will also be judged very clearly. They can't be rebellious and disobedient. Same thing. So I've made some of those observations here in section 4. Selected observations on the Jude reference. I borrowed the term from 2 Peter on Tartarus and made some comments here about angels and Sodom and Gomorrah. Would have to be usually seen as demon possession, or for some they had the power to assume human bodies in order that they might be able to be involved with human women. John, you come back to that statement you made earlier. Why is it something that only happened prior to the flood and apparently doesn't happen anymore? There's no record in the Revelation thereafter that angels who often appear as men appeared as men in order to have sexual relations with women. Demon-possessed men being involved in sexual immorality is one thing. Angels assuming a body, an angelophany, for that is another thing altogether. Does 1 Peter refer to angels in prison, or does it refer to Christ in his pre-existent state preaching to those who are now in prison, who heard the message during the 120 years of Noah's time? Okay, I've given you the special bibliography here by Wayne Grudem. John Feinberg also has an article in Westminster Theological Journal, 48 of 1986. John Feinberg, Westminster Theological Journal, 48 of 1986. Outstanding article on 1 Peter 3:18 through 20. Where he suggests that maybe we shouldn't be speaking in terms of preaching to spirits in prison, and that wouldn't identify back to Genesis 6. So here's an honest appraisal and conclusion. You know, you can throw out all those observations and you can see more of these in any systematic theology that's going to deal in detail with angelology. In fact, a number of these are given by John Davis in these Paradise to Prison. It's nicely done. Set out the different views, as you'll also find in that book, Introduction to the Pentateuch, the different views and the reactions, and the weaknesses and the flaws. So you can take a look at those. I've just thrown out a series of observations and said, what about this, what about that, think about this, think about that. And you know what, where do you stand? I said, I lean towards the angelic, and I'm going to take the break and come back and go through something on that. But I haven't quite put my foot down. I'm standing like a comedy situation where somebody opens a door and the staircase is missing, and he teeters there, you know, with his one foot out, and you're waiting to see him fall, and then he recovers his balance. Well, that's where I am. I'm leaning over no staircase. This seems to be the way to go. I think this is where I'm going to land, but I'm not quite ready to fall. Put my foot down. Would I tell my congregation that? Absolutely. I think I would. But I would stress, let's put our focus on where the passage has its focus. You can get so involved with the angelic idea of Genesis 6 and sons of God that you miss the focus of the passage. This is a run-up to an expression of the reason why God brought the flood. Focus on the depravity of man. In the midst of life that was going on prior to the flood, men were bad. And has it changed? No, not at all. So an honest appraisal. Just stay with me for 5 minutes, then we take a break. Newman brings his article to a close, points out a couple of things. The earliest extant view was the supernatural one. That's what is in all the earlier commentaries in Jewish Targums. The sons of God being angels, and the Nephilim the giant offspring of the sinful and unnatural angel-human union. That the non-supernatural views, Jewish and Christian, and he lists a number of these, were not extant until later. This is interesting. The earliest commentaries and suggestions were supernatural beings. The later ones, both Jewish and Christian, said no. These were noblemen and judges, dynastic rulers, tyrants. The Nephilim, violent warriors, reading in that they had unrestrained lust, rape and bestiality being their sins for the Jewish view. Or the sons of God were Sethites, believers. Daughters of men were Canaanites, unbelievers, whose sin was mixed marriages, and that was basically the Christian view. But then he pulls it all together and he says, may it not be possible that we enlightened 20th century Christians can learn something positive from the ancient exegetes? Perhaps they were right in seeing an angelic incursion in Genesis 6, and we are wrong in denying it. It's interesting. In such a case, that perhaps with a great interest in the supernatural and angels, some ancient interpreters scoured the scriptures to find some hint or help or suggestion that would say this is angelic. They might have reached some valid insights which we could follow. Maybe. I don't want to knock the fact that the earliest exegetes thought angelic creature. However, I don't also want to say those that were nearest to the text were always right, 100%, because they could have been wrong too, which as men studied further and refined their understanding, they said, sorry, but you Jewish Targum guys were wrong. You know, we 16th, 17th, 18th century scholars are right. Take a break. Then I want to come back and whip through something about angels and demons in Genesis 6, and if and thus argumentation. Angels, demons in Genesis 6. if Satan proudly thought to take God's place and to steal his glory, which he did, it's recorded in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, assuming that 14 and 28 do refer to Satan and the fall. And if Satan worked aggressively to confront God's workings at every level, even though restricted in his activities and the extent of those activities, he does aggressively seek to confront God's working. We had that long list back in the notes. Job 1 and 2 would be an illustration of that, and Luke 22 would be a reference to him seeking to sift Peter as wheat. Certainly there is an opposition to truth and to God and to godliness in every respect. And if you can also point out that Satan indirectly sought to get back at God in a number of different ways, one by corrupting the children of God, certainly his temptation of Eve and Adam, who we'd call the children of God, and Israel, leading them into idolatry and giving them false leaders. Remember, they sacrificed their sons and daughters to demons, Psalm 106. There's a multiple of ways you can see in which Satan did his best to attack Israel, to corrupt them, to turn them aside from truth, not to follow God's word. If he sought to corrupt the disciple of Christ as well, Judas, which he did, put into his mind to betray Christ, entered into him to carry out that betrayal. If he also tried to corrupt the Son of God, Jesus Christ, in Matthew 4, the temptation in the wilderness, he couldn't do so, but he sure tried hard. And if he instigated the crucifixion of Christ, pushing, grabbing hold of their hatred, and putting forward the murderer, remember what Jesus' words were? This is your hour and the power of darkness. That time has come, so they instigated the crucifixion of Christ, which was done, of course, within the providential plan of God. Then, if all this is true, direct aggressive confrontation, indirect corruption or attempts to turn aside, then his corrupting of angels, the servants of God, should not be all that surprising. There are persons and personal creatures too, and Revelation 12 points out that there were at least a third of them that followed Satan. But let's take it a step further. In other words, the possibility of angelic involvement is not pushed out. It may just be another way to corrupt, to turn the line away, to destroy what God was trying to do. Now, if Satan is behind false prophets, false teachers, false shepherds, and you can point to the fact that all of them exploit, manipulate, and misguided the people. 2 Peter 2 would be the warning. False teachers always been there. Matthew 23 would be a reference to those Pharisees who bind heavy burdens on people. They were false leaders, would not lift a finger to help them from their burdens. 1 Samuel 8, Lamentations 4 and Philippians 3 speaking also, Lamentations 4 speaks of priests also in the midst of Israel. Let me turn to Lamentations 4 verse 13. Lamentations 4:13 is what I'm looking at. Can't read my writing there. The sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests, who shed in her midst the blood of the just. This is pretty out and out confrontation with the truth of God about being just, obedient, and righteous. And one of the patterns in Israelite history, remember, was in her corruption and in disobedience, the just and the righteous were not treated properly, but were maltreated by the false leaders of the nation. 1 Samuel 8, you'd look at verses 10 through 26. Also false teachers or false prophets that bring a burden upon the nation and lead them astray. Philippians 3, I'm looking at the enemies of the cross. Remember Paul said, I tell you about them who follow their own lusts, who are enemies of the cross. I warn you about them right from the beginning. False teachers. Now if Satan is behind such false teachers and shepherds, and if, turn over page, the angels who kept not their own domain, which would be Jude 6, occurs in a context of false shepherds who fleeced the flock and who were enticed through sensuality and greed to exploit them. And that's obviously there in Jude 6. These were men who crept in unawares, spots on the love feasts, false leaders, false teachers, introducing doctrine that totally disturbed the life of the church. If angels who fell occurs within such a context, and man's corruption is also seen in the same context, the baseness of man, the immoral behavior of man, the lewdness of man, the unreasoning animal-like nature that is used to describe them in Jude. And if the spirits in prison has its context too, of and you'll have to spend some time looking at the context in 1 Peter in particular. If I turn there, you see what I mean. The reason why I don't want to stop and spend time going through this piece by piece is because you get it in your Old Testament studies with Professor Essex. I know because I checked with him. And you'll also get it with Dr. Roscup. If you have exhortation in 1 Peter 3 on purity of life, and it's there in 1 Peter 3:2, chaste conduct accompanied by fear, calling it for purity of life, 16 and 17 of the same chapter. Having a good conscience, that when they defame you as evildoers, those who revile your good conduct in Christ may be ashamed. For it is better, if it is the will of God, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. And exhortation on purity of life and doing right. And if you have further exhortation in chapter 4, verses 2 through 4, on not indulging the flesh, which would be another way of speaking about purity of life, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness, etc. In regard to these, I think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. Your lifestyle has changed. You don't get involved in these things anymore. So now let me pick up the thread again. If angels fell occurs in this context of false shepherds, false teachers, false leaders who fleece the flock through sensuality and greed. And if man's corruption is also seen in those contexts, and it is in 2 Peter 2, and if when you look at the spirits in prison you can pick verses from the preceding context on purity of life, on not indulging in the flesh, not lewdness, immorality, etc., then maybe you can draw the conclusion that fallen angels in immorality is not that unexpected a thing. That they could very well be living in impurity and in wickedness. Now, do you understand what I'm doing? If Satan interjects sensuality, immorality, sexual excess, dissipation, exploitation, greed in mankind, if that's part of what he is and what he does, then it is possible that given fallen angels, they may also be pushed by Satan into immorality, lewdness, dissipation, excess. Okay? You follow? Then I recall Balaam and the wages of unrighteousness. 2 Peter 2:15. You remember the story? You'd have to go back to the Old Testament to look. 2 Peter 2:15. They have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness and rebuked for his iniquity. And his plan was what? To corrupt Israel through sexual sin. Seen in Numbers 22 following. And the major problem with Canaanite Baalism is also to be seen as a corrupting influence. So I recall Balaam and the wages of unrighteousness and his plan to corrupt, and the corruption of Baalism upon Israel took the exile to drive that out of them. So the question, the biggie, did Satan instigate sexual immorality and perversion to corrupt angels? Did he? Could he? But angels don't marry. In heaven they don't. But on earth and fallen? No answer. The question can be posed. I mean, you can follow the if argumentation. Okay, here's an opponent, aggressive confrontation, lewdness, licentiousness, lasciviousness, hallmark of his activities and his influence. If he seeks directly and indirectly to corrupt, has done so at every level down through history with God's actions and God's plans, then why could he not have influenced fallen angels to be the same? Doesn't solve one major problem. Could angels, without possessing men, have been sexually involved with women? And if it was possession of men, could possessed men that are supposedly so evil be called sons of God? So the question can be posed. The answer in part, angels don't marry, but you left dangling. Where do I go from here? Good question. I have no idea. I think you just have to be honest. So I need enlightenment. I really do. I wish for more information. I can put up the options. You can follow the argument as well as I can in a paper like this. Additional notes on the identity of the sons of God. Who were they? Here's the options. Here's the bibliography. Here's the arguments for and against, which are just an expanded version of chart 42 of Wayne House. And it ends up with, in this case, taking the idea of Sethite line. It seems to me there are two major options that surface in evangelical circles. Either it's the line of Seth that went apostate and married ungodly women, which they should never have done because ungodly marriages have always been frowned upon in Scripture. So they just took wives and took wives and took wives, not for the sake of godliness, but they had perverted their own heritage. And so there's nothing left but Noah, and violence is supreme. There would be Sethite line or angelic creatures. And both say, but maybe it's not that certain. It could be angels, it could be Sethite. Yeah. Shall I leave it right there? Yeah. Because I have nothing else to say on Genesis 6. I'd like to be able to say, bang, 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 bang. Got those facts. Bang, bang, bang. Got those facts. Obvious conclusion. What's the argument about? Good men have disagreed for centuries. If you can come up with an answer, you'll take the evangelical world by storm, including the liberal world, who won't accept your words anyway. Yeah, Paul.
You had two questions that you were mentioning earlier. One was that could possessed men be called the sons of God? Could you reiterate what the other option was, the question that you had?
Could angels, as in their own person, without possessing a man, could angels have sexual relations with women, fallen angels? Or angels that have been corrupted and pushed towards lasciviousness and lewdness. And if that isn't the case, it's demon-possessed men, then could demon-possessed men be called sons of God? Without any further description somewhere in the immediate context. And I'd have a third question too. If the violence was initiated by sons of God who are angelic beings, then how come no judgment is pronounced on them at all in the immediate context which deals with the violence of men? It seems to ignore them altogether. Yeah.
He said that Satan initiates sexual morality and perversion to corrupt angels. So you're saying that Satan was, Genesis chapter 6, right before that, he was tempting angels to come on down and have a good time? Is that...
No, I wouldn't say come on down and have a good time, right? So when they fell with him.
Way back when?
In the beginning. It could very well be true that he corrupted them to the point of sexual immorality is for you too.
Okay.
But it's suppositions, Stephen, that's the problem.
Not that he tempted them with it.
No, it's not an ongoing temptation.
Like he tempts us to sin.
Yeah.
Whether now that they're here, he says, go on, get some more.
It was just a supposition following an argument. If Satan has done this in the physical realm of men and the plans of God, then is it possible that he also did this in the realm of the angels? But it doesn't solve your problem. Even if you say yes, it still leaves you with those questions that need to be asked about sons of God and possession of men and judgment not on them.
And I guess with that, maybe this is a silly question, but are demons getting more corrupted? Like man can get more depraved?
Does somebody want to answer that? Because there is an answer. See how much of your previous notes you remember. You want to reword the question?
Are demons who are already fallen? Just like man, man is totally depraved, but yet to the point he can get worse. Man can continually get worse. And angels continually get corrupted worse to the point of...
Good question. Can demons get more corrupt than they are? Nobody wants to answer. Remember that parable about the demon? Remember that? Because I lost the passage. Stripped, left and came back and brought back with him 7 demons more corrupt than himself. Ben?
Wouldn't the question be more like, does God have any grace upon fallen angels? Because the reason why we're not more corrupt than we should be is because God's common grace upon man. If we're going to compare man to
Restraint.
demons.
Because there is restraint. Yeah. Yeah.
The parable in Matthew 12, isn't that he comes and gets friends that are more wicked than him? So that doesn't mean that he's gotten more wicked, does it? Or does it?
Well, if you remember, I can't remember in the notes where we dealt with it, but All you can say is that there obviously are degrees of depravity in the angelic, in the occult realm. But you cannot take the next step and say, that means there is an ongoing increase of depravity on the part of some. So, see, I'm getting more evil than you. So I need a badge. And we're moving up the ranks here. You have hierarchies. You don't know enough about that other than there are these hierarchies and levels of leadership and activity, and that you have degrees of depravity, and that's it. That's all you know. Anything else beyond that is speculation, and you've got to be careful. Be too easy. You know, in cases like this, the pathway of truth is so narrow that if you don't watch yourself, you fall off. You have to walk, it's like walking on a knife edge. Let me keep strictly within the bounds of Scripture and draw no conclusions beyond that. Stay where I am. And be honest enough with the congregation to say that. Yeah.
Like God is absolute to the limit of goodness.
Right.
So Satan and demons have the absolute corruptness. They cannot be more corrupted because they are corrupt to the maximum.
And fixed in there and confirmed in their corruption and depravity. Absolutely opposed to God at every turn. We've talked about that a number of times. Yeah.
I heard it said one time that evil wasn't created by God. Evil is simply the absence of God. So in terms of the demons and Satan being apart or separated from God, then it's a smorgasbord kind of do.
Sure. Whatever is the expression of opposition, aggressive opposition to God, truth and the believer, and the plans of God, that's what you have from Satan and his angels. Somebody else? Dax, yeah.
I was just a little confused because we just said to me that angels, the fallen angels, are confirmed in their opposition to God and therefore are sort of the antithesis and think of wickedness of God, and yet the Matthew 12 parable kind of says that there are demons who are more wicked than other demons, so there's some sort of gradation there too. And
yeah, that's all you can say.
Okay.
But locked in opposition. At every level, they're locked in opposition. You know, one who's less depraved is not less opposed. Still locked in opposition. And that's an enigmatic passage anyway. What are the waterless places, remember? Is this a reference to the nation being spoken about metaphorically? Are there any facts to be drawn? And we drew a series of statements. We said, okay, you can draw some facts that a demon can leave its place of habitation, the human body, make its own choice to leave, but he can't just easily move into anything else. Thus he wanders around. That there is apparently a particular place called waterless places where demons, I don't know how else to explain it, where they live or have their activity outside the human body. It would be the occult realm, waterless places suggesting no satisfaction of any kind. There are varying degrees of wickedness associated with them, and apparently they can go back to what they had before if that person has not been closed to them. That's all you can say, and then you have to say Scripture provides no clarity upon this. It was Lenski who made the good comment. In Matthew, he said this, Jesus knows the way of demons, we do not. As in the case of other facts for which we have no explanation, we accept this as a fact. He knows, we don't. What he's revealed, we know. What he hasn't revealed, we don't. Stop right there. This is to add to your notes on Satan. Wherever you put them in, it doesn't matter, but I've tucked it in at the very end of the notes dealing with Satan and demons. I'm picking up on John 8, 38 through 44, because there is the discussion of the relationship with Satan. John 8, passage we looked at a number of times. You are of your father, the devil. I know that you are Abraham's descendants, but you seek to kill me because my word has no place in you. I speak what I've seen with my father, and you do what you have seen with your father. They answered and said to him, Abraham is our father. Very proud of that fact. Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. Abraham did not do this. You do the deeds of your father. Then they said to him, this is a nasty little jab. We were not born of fornication. We have one Father, God. And Jesus said to him, if God were your Father, you would love me. For I proceeded forth and came from God, nor have I come of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? Because you're not able to listen to my word. You are of your father, the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. So that one that's referred to in the text is a reference back to ho diabolos, the devil. You are of your father the devil, diabolou, and the desires of your father you want to do. He, that one, diabolou, was a murderer and a liar. When it says from the beginning, abgees, it's referring obviously to a definite historical starting point, which is what event? It's proposed by the commentators as being either the murder of Abel by Cain, picking up on the fact that he was a murderer from the beginning, or that it's a reference to the beginning of world history. Right back there, he was there. Or that it refers to falsehood brought about the fall of man, which brought about the fall of man and thus the death of man. So you've got three options that are put forward. It's his murder of Abel. That's what's been referred to as in the beginning. From the beginning. Look at what he did. It's the murder of Abel by Cain, which is a little later. Or it's at the very beginning of world history. Or let's be more specific. In falsehood, in deceit, he tempted Eve and Adam and brought about the fall of man, thus killing man, bringing about the death of man. That would be the murderer from the beginning. The title, a murderer, might be suggested or at least used in the text because of the intent of the Jews to kill Jesus in verse 40. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth. They were going to be murderers. Descriptive title number 2 is liar. Vivid and emphatic description is given. And when you read those, when I was reading, I'm sure you noticed that there's a mutual exclusivity here. The devil and truth do not walk on the same path. He's at home with lying. He ain't at home with truth. Not at all. In fact, there's an instructive choice of words in the context. He does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him, your first haughty clause. There is no truth in him. And the second one, when he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources because he is a liar and the father of lies. And he's its source, origin, founding father. Lying comes from him. It belongs to him naturally. A very instructive and vivid description of Satan, murderer and liar. Now, you pick up on how to explain the relationships that are here. Writers have struggled to express these verses. Take your commentary sometime and take a good look. How do you express you are of your father, the devil? Obviously some sort of relationship is involved and has been expressed. What's the definition? What's the explanation? Define it. And you suddenly realize you're talking about influence and involvement, etc. I looked at a number of commentaries and you have a varied description. Leon Morris says their evil deeds are the result of their paternity. There is a family likeness. But it doesn't explain. How? What's the mechanics? It's easy to write, they have a paternity that is false and unrighteous. It's a family likeness. Lenski, you unbelieving Jews are the devil's children. Children are naturally inflamed with the same lusts. They get or inherit these through their spiritual descent from him. Now you see something of an attempt to explain the mechanics. You catch the phrase? Through their spiritual descent from him. Barnes talks about influenced so that they imitate. You have the temper, disposition or spirit of the devil. Merrill Tenney speaks about kinship with Satan without further explanation. Hendrickson speaks about the spiritual descent as being established. Unbelieving to Satan is more than just pleasure seeking. They are spiritually and morally children of the devil. Physically children of Abraham, spiritually children of the devil. You get it? Now what's the sharp contrast to you and I in relation to Abraham?
The children of promise.
You know, we are spiritually children of Abraham, but not physical. The only ones that would be physical and spiritual would be a converted Jew. So physically you belong to Abraham, you Jews, but spiritually you belong to somebody else. Dale Hengstenberg also speaks about the fellowship of inclinations. Satan is the originator of an influence which man receives and by which he is led. The immediate result of spiritual relation of the child to the father, when speaking about these unbelievers to Satan, is a fellowship of inclinations with the begotten, the seed of whom remains in the begotten. In other words, there is such a relationship that you are easily inclined to do wrong, to hate, to murder, to lie. So I've drawn your attention to verse 38. It says you are doing the things you heard from your father. Verse 44, you are wanting, you're wishing, thelo, to do the desires of your father. He wants to kill, corrupt, destroy. So do you. Verse 37 goes from physical descent to morality. I know that you are Abraham's descendants, but you seek to kill me because you don't accept my word. Here's your physical descent. Here's your moral responsibility or moral action. You're rejecting the word. Switch over occurring. If they really were descended from Abraham, physically and spiritually, they would have done right by Christ. Instead, verse 48 and verse 52 shows you their depravity, which, by the way, is extremely interesting. Think of this. You are of your father, the devil. What does the devil cause them to say in accusation? Did we not say rightly that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? Now we know that you have a demon. Abraham is dead and the prophets, and you say, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never taste death. Are you greater than Abraham? Etc. You catch the significance there. It's really intriguing. You are of your father the devil, and the devil makes them say that Jesus has the devil. Which in that context was a terrible accusation to make, would destroy his integrity. Intrigues. Devil quite capable of using demons as an accusation to destroy a testimony. That's clever, cunning, smart, reading the context of what's going on. Okay. Well, let's try and pull it together here. I've got a synthesis of observations for you. Emphasis is on lineage. Lies not upon physical Abrahamic lineage, but rather upon man's moral and spiritual disposition as he responds to truth and the messenger of God. It should be emphasizing, it is not the emphasizing of the lineage, but of the moral disposition that should be responding right to the truth. The knot's in the wrong place. Not emphasizing the lineage, but the moral disposition insofar as it should respond to the messenger and the truth. They assessed Christ falsely and demonstrated that different disposition. There was not a moral one. Satan originated sin in the universe and has influenced men ever since. So that permits use of the paternal terms. You know what the relationship of Satan to man is? Father to son, father to child. Influencing, teaching, directing that person.